Hi, and welcome back to this casual Friday edition of Focal Point on AFR Talk. Great to have you in the conversation today. Want to begin by talking about the what happened yesterday at the UN. Got a couple of sound bites that we want to play for you, and let me grab the right stack of stories here to talk about the vote in the UN yesterday, where the UN voted yesterday to essentially recognize Palestinian statehood. And I've got a couple of sound bites to play for you, and then we want to talk a little about what's going on in the Islamic world, because this touches on the issue of religious liberty. First of all, here is Hillary Clinton, and she is talking here about the vote that was taken yesterday in the UN, which basically grants recognition, grants to the Palestinian state what's called observer status, where they have some sort of official recognition now by the UN as a governing body. They don't have voting privileges, but they can observe. It gives them access to international courts and other sorts of things. And, of course, you've got a situation now in Israel where the Palestinians have never, ever recognized the right of Israel to exist. Not once, not ever. And we'll hear the ambassador, Israel's ambassador to the UN, basically make that point in some of his comments before the UN. And so it's kind of put the Obama administration kind of in a tough spot, because their sympathies, the sympathies of Barack Obama, are almost entirely with the Muslim world, with the Islamic world. So his sympathies are totally with the Palestinians. Hillary Clinton's sympathies are totally with the Palestinians. But this is so obviously one-sided, and it is so obviously an affront to Jews all over the world, including Jews in America that vote about 70% for Barack Obama, that they're sort of in a tough spot and having to try to finesse this thing. And here's what Hillary Clinton said yesterday about this UN Palestinian vote. Clip one. Let's listen.
I want to say a few words about the unfortunate and counterproductive resolution at the United Nations General Assembly that just passed, because it places further obstacles in the path to peace. We have been clear that only through direct negotiations between the parties can the Palestinians and Israelis achieve the peace they both deserve. Two states for two people, with a sovereign, viable, independent Palestine living side by side in peace and security with a Jewish and democratic Israel.
So that is Hillary Clinton. This is not helpful, she says. This vote is an actual deterrent and obstacle to peace. Now, here is the Israeli ambassador to the UN. This is clips 2 and 3. And he gave a great speech at the UN yesterday that I thought did a pretty good job of laying out the basic issue here and the basic problem from an Israeli perspective. And I want you to listen very carefully to what he has to say, because he touches here on the history of that land, the history of the relationship between the Palestinians and the Jews. And realize when you listen to his comments that the word Palestine, Palestinians, that's a totally made-up word, number one. It was invented basically by the Romans in the 2nd century A.D. And the reason they invented it, they found the Jews to be so pesky that when they had to go back in 135 A.D. and just clean out another Jewish rebellion, they wiped out the city of Jerusalem, and they decided to change the name of the country from Judea, because Judea's got the word Jew in it. Basically, it's connected to Judaism, to the Jewish people. They wanted to get rid of any trace. And that's when the diaspora happened, the scattering, where the Jews were scattered to all corners of the Roman Empire. And so they changed the name from Judea to Palestine. That is a corruption of the word Philistia, or Philistine, like Goliath was a Philistine. That was kind of the nearest sliver of land that had kind of a separate name. And so they grabbed that name, Philistia, and they applied it to what used to be known as the land of Judea. So same people still living there. There's no ethnic difference in the people that are living there in the land of Judea. It's now called the land of Palestine. That's how it was pronounced in Latin, but it's the same people. The ethnic makeup of the people is exactly the same. There's no difference. There are no Arabs there. It's Jews. The people that are left were Jews. So they were now called, from that point forward, by the Romans, they were called Palestinians. Didn't call them Jews anymore. They called them residents of Palestine. And you move forward even into the 20th century, and Palestine and Palestinian was even in the early part of the 20th century into the mid part of the 20th century a term that was used to refer to Jews. You had a Palestinian symphony orchestra, which was an all-Jewish orchestra. It was called the Palestinian Symphony Orchestra. There wasn't an Arab or a Muslim in the batch. There were Palestinian militias that were made up of Jews. So with that as a backdrop, listen to what this ambassador to the UN had to say. This is his name is Ron Poser, and this is, I think, very perceptive observations that he makes speaking to the UN before the vote took place. Let's listen, clip one.
President Abbas described today's proceeding as historic, but the only thing historic about his speech is how much it ignored history. The truth is that 65 years ago today, the United Nations voted to partition the British Mandate into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. 2 states for 2 people. Israel accepted this plan. The Palestinians and the Arab nations around us rejected it and launched a war of annihilation to throw the Jews into the sea. The truth is that from 1948 till 1967, the West Bank was ruled by Jordan and Gaza was ruled by Egypt. The Arab states did not lift a finger to create a Palestinian state. Instead, they sought Israel's destruction and were joined by a newly formed Palestinian terrorist organization. The truth is that at Camp David in 2000 and again in Annapolis in 2008, Israeli leaders made far-reaching offers for peace. Those offers were met by rejection, evasion, and even terrorism. The truth is to advance peace, in 2005, Israel dismantled entire communities and uprooted thousands of people from their homes in the Gaza Strip. And rather than use this opportunity to build a peaceful future, the Palestinians turned Gaza into an Iranian terror base from which thousands of rockets were fired into Israeli cities. As we were reminded just last week, the area has been turned into a launching pad for rockets into Israeli cities, a haven for global terrorists, and an ammunition dump for Iranian weapons. Time after time, the Palestinian leadership refused to accept responsibility. They refused to make the tough decisions for peace. Israel remains committed for peace, but we will not establish another Iranian terror base in the heart of our country. We need a peace that will endure, a peace that will secure the future of Israel.
So that is the ambassador to the UN for Israel, and he makes some very, very important points. We'll play a second clip from him in just a second. But he makes the point, this is a very perceptive point, very important to remember that when the UN established the nation of Israel in 1948, they at the same time established a Palestinian state. In other words, when they partitioned the British Mandate in 1948, they partitioned it to have a Jewish state side by side with an Arab state. 2 states for 2 peoples. Israel accepted it. They declared their independence in 1948. It was the Arab nations that rejected it. 5 of the surrounding nations went to war against Israel and tried to drive it into the sea. So his point is, look, this 2-state solution, this was offered from the very beginning. This was offered in 1948. It was offered by the United Nations. Everybody says, hey, the United Nations, if they're on the left, this is the ultimate governing body. This is the globalist body that we all ought to revere and all ought to bow down to, and we ought to support everything the United Nations does. This is the gold standard. Well, the United Nations said 2 states. It was the Arabs that rejected it and the Jews that accepted it. Israel as a nation has more legitimacy in the eyes of liberals than any other nation in the world because it was brought into being by the United Nations. This, to them, is their supreme governing body. Everything they do has got the touch of of God about it. So when the United Nations brings the state of Israel into being, liberals ought to say, well, that settles it for me. That's good enough for me. But it doesn't. Man, it was the Arab nations that rejected this proposal. Here's clip number 2 from the UN ambassador from Israel.
3 months ago, Israel's prime minister stood in this very hall, at this very podium, and extended his hand to peace to President Abbas. He reiterated that his goal was to create a solution for 2 states, for 2 people, where a demilitarized Palestinian state would recognize Israel as a Jewish state. That's right, 2 states for 2 people. In fact, President Abbas, I did not hear you use the phrase 2 states for 2 people this afternoon. In fact, I have never heard you say the phrase 2 states for 2 people, because the Palestinian leadership has never recognized that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. They've never been willing to accept what this very, very body recognized 65 years ago. Israel is the Jewish state. In fact, today you ask the world to recognize a Palestinian state, but you still refuse to recognize the Jewish state. Not only do you not recognize the Jewish state, you're also trying to erase Jewish history. This year, you even tried to erase the connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem. You said that Jews were trying to alter the historical character of Jerusalem. You said that we're trying to Judaize Jerusalem. President Abbas, the truth is that Jerusalem had the Jewish character long before most cities in the world had any character. 3,000 years ago, King David ruled from Jerusalem, and Jews have lived in Jerusalem ever since. President Abbas, instead of revising history, it is time that you started making history by making peace with Israel.
So that is the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Ron Prosser, I'm not sure how you say his name. A great speech, and he made a very perceptive point there. Israel has recognized the right of the Palestinians to have their own state. The Palestinians have never, ever, Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, has never, ever used the word state to refer to Israel. Back into Focal Point AFR Talk.